Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jaimie Krems. She is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Oklahoma State University. She is a social psychologist with interdisciplinary training. Her research draws on theoretical perspectives from social psychology, behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology, and anthropology, as well as animal behavior, to investigate how people use cues to strategically navigate their social worlds and meet their social goals. So, Jaimie, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let's start perhaps with this question, since we're going to talk about mostly human female sociality and how women establish relationships among themselves and perhaps with men as well. What were some of the biggest challenges that women had to face during our evolutionary history that sort of shaped their sociality?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of undergrads will often ask, how can you know anything about what women were like then? And I'll say women pretty often interchangeably, though we know that there is usefulness in splitting gender and sex, but to talk about it. So there are some things we can be pretty certain about. For example, women got pregnant, there was lactation. It was massively calorically and energetically expensive. And so we can have a pretty good understanding that those were some challenges that human females uniquely faced. Also, being physically smaller and less physically formidable than men. So we can be pretty certain about that. We can be pretty certain that women didn't band together to engage in intergroup warfare. Given some evidence from more modern evidence from small-scale societies, as well as archaeological evidence. There's a really great book on the sort of mythology of the Amazons that talks about how interesting it is, but in reality, we don't have the archaeological evidence to suggest anything like large-scale or really intergroup warfare among women. So the male typical features for sort of managing issues of intergroup conflict aren't there. The costs and benefits of allyship and friendship might be a little different. And then there are some things that we're a little bit less certain about, but seem to be potentially there based on mitochondrial evidence, for example. So patrilocality, the idea that males stayed in their natal area, whereas females migrated out. Perhaps dealing with co-wives, so that sort of increased zero-sumness where multiple females are co-wives to one male, which can have knock-on psychological effects. So we actually have a pretty good picture of what some of the sex-typical or sex-unique challenges would have been.
Mhm. And in what ways did these challenges influence specifically the kinds of relationships that women establish with other women and with men?
Yeah, so with pregnancy, lactation, you need to get massive caloric resources when you might be less capable of getting them yourself. So most of your resource acquisition is going to come through your relationships. And that might affect women's relationships and how women form relationships, with whom women form relationships. For example, potentially being more attracted to males who have a greater amount of resources to provide, perhaps especially during that time. And then you have being physically smaller and less physically formidable than men. And this can have massive effects on the ways that women aggress. So one of the theories of indirect aggression, although I should say I don't buy this, is that indirect aggression arises because women are less formidable than men, and so they're striking out in the best way that they can. Indirect aggression being prototypically gossip, for example. So not using physical strength, but using behind the back words, dirty looks, things like that that don't evoke face-to-face combat where women wouldn't be likely to take men. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but that is one of the ideas. And then the notion that women didn't band together in intergroup warfare bears on a lot about our friendships, I think. So people like Joyce Benenson have studied this beautifully. Males seem to have a greater tolerance for genetically unrelated same-sex others. So males will have conflict with other males and then reconcile right away. They can cooperate right after having conflict. You see this after sports matches, for example, the good game, good game, good game. And this is just anecdata, but if I were playing Russell Westbrook, the basketball player in the States, I would not say good game afterwards. I would wait in the parking lot and then hit him, because I'm a horrible person, but that's beside the point. Oh God, please cut that out. So we really do see that males seem to be more tolerant, more forgiving, whereas over the lifespan of females' shorter, closer friendships, there are more insults to that friendship, and that friendship is more likely to be turbulent, unstable, and end earlier. And really, truly, part of this might come from the added sort of costs of males being able to compete with one another, but then eventually band together, ultimately defending the group in intergroup warfare. For patrilocality, for dealing with co-wives, again, that seems to have potential implications for female friendships as well. So not everyone buys this, but Tanya Reynolds, for example, has an incredible piece in Archives of Sexual Behavior that sort of takes us through this idea that if females are recurrently leaving the natal area, they need to build kin-like relationships with other females in order to get the benefits to survive. So those resources like calories, like social protection. And if they're going to do that with other females, that's great, they should, but it's not underlain by genetic relatedness the way that it might be for males who get to stay in their natal area. And Anne Campbell has some incredible work on that in her 2002 book.
Yeah, and specifically about female friendships, I mean, with when it comes to establishing friendships with other females, with whom do women tend to establish friendships with, and in what ways do they differ perhaps from the kinds of friendships males establish among themselves?
Yeah, so we see a lot of sex segregation from pretty early on. So females establish relationships, friendships with other females. They tend to be pretty similar in age, although we're doing some work right now on age preferences and friendships, which has not been as well studied as it has been in mating relationships, obviously. But if you look at this, there are sort of some interesting paradoxes in the literature on female friendships. So there's sort of this like meta paradox that on one hand, female friends, it's impossible for females to form friendships with other females. They just can't do it. In reality, they're petty, catty, horrible people, and the costs of competition are too great. And on the other hand, people have said that, in fact, female friendships are the zenith of friendship. They're the closest, most wonderful, emotionally intense, true. And I think this sort of large paradox arises from two smaller ones, which is basically female friendships are, compared to males, marked by emotional intensity and self-disclosure, but also short-lived and fragile. And female friendships are strictly avoiding competition. If you look like you're competing, you look like you're ambitious, you look like you want to be superior to us, you are going to get kicked out of the friendship and the friendship group. And at the same time, the friendships are actually competitive and part of status competition and yield access to resources. So it's strictly non-competitive, but also competitive. And so these female friendships seem to be marked by those paradoxes. Um, in terms of what they look like, we do have a pretty good idea across cultures. Again, females form relationships preferentially with other females, similar age, often dyadic, so one-on-one friendships that are a lot about talking, self-disclosure, what they think of anything going on, other people who aren't there, whereas males tend to form these multi-male groups, excuse me, that are sort of considered more quote-unquote shoulder-to-shoulder friendships. So they're going to do activities together, whereas females are going to talk together. I should say, though, so these structural differences are very interesting, but there are way more similarities than differences. And when we do find these differences, their effect size around Cohen's d of 3 most of the time, 0.3, sorry, most of the time. So they're smallish, and they probably also vary very widely across cultures. A lot of that, though, we just don't know. We need a lot more funding and a lot more people dedicated to understanding whether these structural differences in friendships between men and women are true not only across cultures, but across the age span. I can't speak to that because we just don't have the data, which is ridiculous at this point. The basic descriptive data, we just don't have it.
Yeah, but with the data that we have, is it possible for us to say that one kind of friendship, I mean, for example, male friendship is less complicated than female friendship, or is that not the best way of thinking about it?
I don't know if I would say it's less complicated, but males do seem less interested. So work by Amanda Rose, for example, males simply seem less interested in the sort of Machiavellian motives of using friends to attack other friends or to gain status, or taking a friend to harm someone else. Whereas females, friends seem to be at once, important sources of happiness, but also cudgels. So there's certainly a veil over female friendship and sociality that we haven't lifted, and it does seem more complex right now. Whether or not it is remains to be seen, and more funding is needed.
Yeah, but in terms of the competitive aspects of female friendship, does it have anything to do with the kinds of perhaps traits that females are selected for when it comes to sexual selection? So, for example, is there more conflict when there's a disparity in terms of their physical attractiveness?
So we do see that if you, and my graduate student, Laurie and Mary, is doing some work on this right now. If you ask the question, what evokes aggression from other women, it is physical attractiveness. So the more physically attractive women are more likely to be denigrated. Women who often, who otherwise give cues of sexual availability, not just desirability, but availability, like dressing, quote unquote, promiscuously or wearing a lot of makeup, high heels. Those women are also going to be preferentially aggressed against by other women. And there's some evidence to suggest that more physically attractive women, at least in the developmental literature, are also more capable and maybe even more likely to engage in aggression themselves, proactive aggression, but that is less clear than is the case among men, where we see more physically formidable men often engaging in more aggression, but proactive aggression rather than reactive aggression. With women, the case is a little bit clearer right now that women who are highly desirable to men by being sexually desirable, beautiful, young, symmetrical, healthy, by showing off their desirability to men via clothing and cues like that, they're the ones other women are going to preferentially aggress against. Did that actually answer your question?
Yes, but let me just ask you, since you're mentioning aggression, how does this aggression manifest, particularly in the case of women? I mean, because when it comes to men, I would imagine that it's mostly physical aggression, but in the case of women, when we use the term aggression, are we referring only to physical aggression or also to other kinds of aggression?
That's fantastic question. So the short answer is that when we think about female aggression, we should be thinking about forms of aggression that are indirect, social, and relational. So things like gossip, dirty looks, using relationships to harm one another, non-physical aggression that is often covert and typically allows the aggressor to remain anonymous from the target of aggression. So I might gossip about you, but you might never know I did it. Or if you know that somebody gossiped about you, you don't know it was me. So it's hard for you to retaliate against me. Additionally, I would add to this notion, it makes it a lot of this kind of indirect aggression doesn't look like aggression. So if I'm aggressing against Keela Williams, professor of psychology at Hamilton College, and my lab mate sister and collaborator, and I told you, you know, Keela, man, she's just such a bad friend. She's just busy all the time. I don't know why I'm just venting. I just, you know, what our data suggests is that you would have a more negative opinion of her, but my venting, rather than overtly denigrating her and saying, man, that heinous wench is just mean, by venting, it doesn't look like aggression. And so you, my social partner, are less likely to see me as aggressive. So that I would add that as an additional component. And women are probably more likely, and in fact, Tracy Vianco would say overwhelmingly more likely to engage in those sorts of tactics of aggression, indirect tactics of aggression, than direct and overt tactics like punching one another in the face, although they do. Men use both indirect and direct aggression fairly equally, but women tend to eschew direct aggression. Yeah, I said short answer and then I lied.
But does that translate in terms of the levels of certain kinds of psychological traits? So, for example, I would imagine that indirect aggression would be associated with traits like Machiavellianism, but being part of the dark triad, isn't it something that occurs more often among men than women?
So you might expect it to be related to that, and certainly it requires you to track relationships. But men and women can do that well. Non-human primates can do that pretty well. One important factor, though, is that it's not necessarily conscious. So when I'm venting to you, it might feel good to me because it's signaling progress towards some adaptive goal, strengthening our alliance, weakening the alliance between you and somebody else. But I might not realize that I am engaging in any sort of aggression. I think Joyce Benenson has probably put it best here in that, women might have no idea, or people engaging in indirect aggression, I should say, because it really isn't just women, might have no idea that it can essentially inflict costs on the target and or benefit them. So it depends on what our assumptions are to really answer that question.
Okay. Okay, so just another question about aggression, and now talking about human societies in general. Are there specific factors, like, for example, income inequality and sex ratio, that influence cross-cultural variations in aggression?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really cool work on this, sort of starting with the Daly and Wilson stuff on income inequality, suggesting that it can have massive effects as an ecological variable on downstream aggression. And again, when they're talking about aggression, they're particularly talking about physical aggression, or aggression that can be really well measured by things on the state or nation level. So male-male homicide, for example, which is much easier to observe, measure, and get good data on than gossip, right? Which is by design hard to observe. So when they're talking about aggression, they're talking about what we typically conceptualize as aggression, physical overt aggression. And income inequality does seem to have pretty big effects on that. One of the potential mechanisms there might be that it increases competitiveness across the sort of income levels. So people who might be living in a really big, beautiful house next to somebody who's living in a slightly bigger and more beautiful house feel compelled to compete with one another in order to maintain the size difference or to get a bigger house and attract more potential partners, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the lower end of the income spectrum, same kind of thing is going on, and it also increases the sort of, it changes the cost-benefit calculus. So if I am a male and I have very little income and I really would like to attract a sexual partner, a female sexual partner, and I know resources are a way to help me do that, well, I really need to get resources. And so I'm more willing to take risks, including risks that might be doing illegal, harmful, violent things in order to sort of get on the fitness board and get resources or show my dominance and attract someone, because it's the only way that I can do that. It simply changes, the benefits of taking those kinds of risks.
Yeah, probably this also connects with the work by Martin Daly when he talks about how single young men that live in contexts of perceived economic inequality tend to put themselves more at risk and be more violent, etc.
Absolutely. I think I have Daly and Wilson's Homicide behind me, although most of my books are at my house now. But Martin Daly has done incredible work on that. People have followed it up pretty beautifully. Folks like Candace Blake are doing some pretty amazing stuff by using Twitter and geolocating different tweets. So I think some work is looking at sex ratio, income inequality, and incel tweets. She is doing just really fascinating stuff there. And that also brings in some of the other ecological factors like sex ratio, for example, which can affect competition.
Yeah. So let me just ask you a general question. When you study human sociality from an evolutionary perspective, do you explore both the sort of ultimate and proximate explanations for a particular behavior, or do you focus more on some of them rather than the other?
Yeah, I mean, this is a disappointing answer, but it depends on the question that I really want to get at the time. So if we sort of think about the Tinbergen's 4 Whys and eating meat, there's all the fun proximate stuff like mechanism. And sometimes I just want to study, I eat meat because it tastes good, the mechanism. I don't typically do the ontological stuff. Over my childhood, I've learned to eat meat because it's culturally normative. I don't typically do the phylogenetic stuff, so when eating meat arose. And then there's function, so why did meat eating evolve in humans, or what function does meat eating serve, like getting calories or protein that helped ancestral humans survive and reproduce. That's typically where I live. Sometimes I'm around the approximate stuff like mechanism, and very often, quite pragmatically, to publish in the types of journals that I want to publish in, social psychology journals, I'll have to get into the mechanism. But I typically start from sort of the John and Lita playbook, the adaptationist playbook of here's a behavior, let's see what its function is, or here's a recurrent challenge that our ancestors would have faced, particularly our female ancestors, like pregnancy and lactation. So what would that have solved? And that's really, I've recently published some work on friendship jealousy. And I love that stuff. I'm really proud of that stuff, and it was a lot of fun. And that's sort of the most nakedly adaptationist work that I've been able to do, where we are simply saying, okay, a recurrent challenge that would have existed is maintaining our friends in these densely interconnected social worlds. And maintaining our friends would have been so important. So what tools might we have to help us do that? And then we can look at friendship jealousy and realize, okay, so it's evoked when people feel that other people might take our friends or our friends might go to other people. It's calibrated to being replaced. And it spurs all of this behavior that might help us mitigate the threat that evoked it in the first place. So behavior we call friend guarding. And it really is just an adaptationist picture there. But it was harder to get that published than a lot of other things, even though it makes a lot of sense. And I think importantly challenges the existing ideas of friendship jealousy, which is just that it's something bad people do because they're malformed, or they never, there's a view that they're just immature. They never grew out of thinking that one person is all they need in life. And in reality, when you take an adaptationist perspective and you see that this behavior exists across cultures, and this behavior, or I should say behavior consistent with friendship jealousy, is evident in some non-human animals, horses, cows, then it's probably not, the output of internalizing Western capitalism, which is one of the explanations. Man, I did not mean to get shirty about that. Sorry.
Yeah, but talking about social psychology, I know that you also study stereotypes and prejudice. So, what would you say are some of the ways traditional social psychology or traditional approaches in social psychology, what do they get wrong about stereotypes and prejudice?
Um, So I think there are sort of three things to note here. And one is that I see it sort of as more a division of labor. A lot of social psychology and the social psychological work on prejudice and stereotyping is limited in scope to one culture and bounded in one history at one time. And so it can be really, really rich and maybe more easily applied to interventions and stuff like that. It's also a little bit limited in view to not just that, but exploring what's bad about the stereotypes and stereotyping and prejudice in general. Not that I am saying they're good, but these phenomena do exist across cultures and have existed across eras, and phenomena that are costly don't spread and persist. So you might notice this difference already in these sort of morally loaded terms of good, bad versus functionally beneficial, useful, costly. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we'll often ask, what do these stereotypes do? What are their functions? And we'll look at the ises versus the oughts. That's a big Steve Newberg thing. He loves to talk about the ises versus the oughts. And we might want to live in sort of the ought land, but we don't. We live in the is land. And so what can we do to sort of understand these stereotypes? So if you think that people feel fear toward targets that pose threats of physical harm, whatever those targets are, whatever you want the reality to be, then you can make solid predictions about the behavior and phenomena that those emotions as an adaptive program will lead people to do. So I think we can make some really nice predictions about some really nasty stuff. So that's the first thing, a sort of division of labor. I can stop there. I can go on to things 2 and 3. I can try and be quick too.
No, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So I also think that a lot of social psychology is a little bit siloed in theoretical traditions. So there's social identity theory, there's realistic conflict theory, there's social role theory, and that's a big one. So for example, on that view, stereotypes emerge from these perceived covariations between different groups being differentially representative in specific societal roles, like males being police officers and females being nursery school teachers. And the idea is that the stereotype characteristics follow the social roles. What I think a lot of Ev work would do is look a little bit beyond that, past the scope of one culture as well, and say if this exists all around the world, that's pretty weird. Because, I mean, if these things are just random, we shouldn't see females being more likely to be nursery school teachers and males being police officers all around the world. It means something else is at play. And then we go into something else. And so sort of the third thing there is just that the Evo perspective is necessarily multidisciplinary. So I myself I studied classical archaeology and Latin because I liked solving puzzles and I liked pretty things. And then I did biological basis of behavior and cognitive and evolutionary anthropology before finishing a PhD in social psychology. And by bringing in the other disciplines and cross-cultural looks, non-human animal behavior, I think we can add a lot of richness to what we think we know about stereotyping and prejudice. That's what I did in a recent paper with Steve Newberg on fat stigma. Sort of the social psychological tradition says that people view bigger as worse, bigger bodies as worse. And that is absolutely true across cultures, even among social perceivers who themselves are higher weight. At the same time, the anthropological tradition, evolutionary anthropology, has told us for a very long time that shape is hugely important. So for women, having a low waist to hip ratio can, probably based on work by Lassick and Gollin, cue future reproductive potential. So it's probably linked to age more than anything else. And having a low waist to hip ratio is considered really attractive on a woman. So if shape is so important across cultures and fat stigma work has just looked at size, what we can do is take that multidisciplinary approach and just bring these things together. And so we found, really unsurprisingly, probably to you and your viewers, that women's body shapes are just as important, if not more important, in driving fat stigma than are women's body sizes alone. So.
But in that specific case, would it also work for men? I mean, do people hold stereotypes about fat men as well?
They do, yeah. So this is where it gets really tricky. For women, it's pretty straightforward. Shape, if you have little abdominal fat and a fair amount of gluteofemoral fat, that's that low waist to hip ratio, sort of the hourglass shape. Mm-hmm. That is going to be more attractive. And so when in our data we see among white Americans, Black Americans, and participants from India, when you have two same height, same weight, and thus same BMI figures, but one has abdominal fat and one has more gluteofemoral fat, the one with gluteofemoral fat is buffered from stigma. And the one with abdominal fat is stigmatized more. And abdominal fat is, to talk about the reality, associated with things that people think about when they think about obesity. So things like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. But what we also see is that women's body shapes vary more than men's do. So when I say that, women have more fat, men have more muscle, typically. And whereas males seem to gain fat in their abdominal area when they gain fat, women can gain fat in multiple areas. And this is what you see in women's magazines from ages, from are you a pear, an apple, a ruler, some other fruit, an upside down triangle? I don't even remember, thank God. But for men, typically, and Michael Barlev has been doing some of this work, looking at the realities in the in real world data, men tend to gain that fat in their abdomen. Women can gain it in their abdomens, they often do, but sometimes they don't gain it in their abdomens and they gain it in their hips and thighs. And so given that women's shapes vary in ways that are linked to future reproductive potential versus not, makes sense, straightforward argument. Men, there's muscle involved, There's sort of a shoulder to hip ratio involved. There's a lot more going on, and the perceptual calculus there is just a little bit more complicated. What we do see, and I think this accords with some work by, I think it's Mitch Brown and Donald Sacco, males who have a little bit of a gut are considered, again, stereotyped to be, inferred to be better dads than average weight males or healthy weight males.
Oh, that's that thing about the dad bod, right?
Yeah. So we see that in our data. We see that for women too, but only for women who have sort of the gluteofemoral fat distribution. But yeah, it's I think sometimes I wonder if, as an evolutionary social psychologist, we're just sort of quantifying the obvious sometimes, and not that there isn't value in that, right? But this is one of those things that I imagine a lot of your viewers will be like, yes, shape matters. So.
Yeah, but I mean, perhaps they don't have an evolutionary rationale to explain it or something like that. So anyway, just to explore a specific example that perhaps will be illustrative of the kinds of things we can do with evolutionary theory when trying to understand where stereotypes come from and why people hold stereotypes with specific content. So and I read even a recent article, I don't know where it was published, where you and another person were talking about stereotypes people hold about women who have casual sex. So could you tell us about it?
Yeah, so that came out pretty recently in Psych Science. It is me and Ara Ko, who is a new mom. So Ara, if you're watching this, I hope you're doing well. Jordan Moon and Michael Varnum, and those three are at ASU. And it was an interesting project that we thought about it from an evolutionary perspective, although the paper won't read that way. And again, that's about the pragmatics of publishing, which is something we could talk about all day, but probably shouldn't. So the short story of what we found is that Americans seem to stereotype women, but not men, who have short-term sex, casual sex, like one-night stands, as having low self-esteem. They don't see them as unattractive, so it's not sort of a reverse halo effect. But they explicitly and implicitly assume that women who have casual sex have low self-esteem, which can have some pretty big knock-on consequences for those women, to the extent that perceptions of self-esteem are linked to not getting sought out as a friend, not getting asked on a date, not being elected to political office or hired for jobs, which evidence seems to suggest.
So, but are these stereotypes right in any way?
So we don't find that. The really interesting thing about that paper, I'm allowed to say that about my own work ever, is that even among the participants who hold this stereotype, we found virtually no association between reported sexual behavior and self-esteem. So the participants who believe that women who have casual sex have low self-esteem, there's no link between their sexual behavior and their self-esteem for women or for men. And in fact, for men, we see a tiny but a negative association. So the more casual sex they have, the lower their self-esteem. And that seems to accord with work, cross-cultural work that Dave Schmidt has done, looking at the realities of this. And people like Zhana, I think if I'm saying that correctly, Zhana Rangelova, she's at NYU, does really cool work on sex. And I think all of these people would say that the reality is so complicated that it just, the reality is far more complicated than our stereotypes. So it makes sense that, yeah, people might have these stereotypes, but the reality is sort of the part where we just sort of throw our hands up and say we don't know yet.
Yeah, but where do these stereotypes come from? Do they have anything to do with the fact that It would be, evolutionarily speaking, more costly for women to have casual sex than for men, for example.
So that's the best guess. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities that you might throw on the table. Intuitively, you might think that, well, people just don't like women who have casual sex because they're norm violators or something like that. But that is not the case because then we'd probably have seen that reverse halo effect. If they didn't like them, they'd find them as having low self-esteem and as unattractive and as bad in other ways. Maybe they might come from media depictions. So I don't know if you've ever seen the show Arrested Development, but
I've heard about it. Yeah.
it's very funny. It's a satirical show, and they do a take on that video series from the 90s, Girls Gone Wild, where it's essentially a bunch of women taking their shirts off on camera, I think. And their take on it, that they titled the series Girls with Low Self-Esteem. And that was funny. So if that's funny, it means there's something there. People are getting that joke and able to encrypt. Ah, yes, okay, I get it.
Right.
But it probably isn't media either, because even if it's pervasive in film, music, and TV, we'd still have to ask where it comes from. And from our perspective, we're thinking in line with what you just said, that given the costs and benefits of short-term sex for women, and that the costs were greater for women than for men historically, it is possible that our Stone Age brains assume that if a woman is engaging in this behavior, she is making the best of a bad strategy, or it's a strategy of last resort. And so there's some link between her self-esteem and that sort of sociometer theory, there's something off, and her sexual behavior.
Right. But do you know, I don't know if you have studied this, but do you know if over time with changes in sexual and gender norms, if these stereotypes are going away to any extent?
So, I mean, I haven't looked at it longitudinally. I think this is the first paper to describe the stereotype, even though there's great work on prejudice and the sexual double standard. But this is one of the biggest sex differences in real world behavior is in short-term sexual behavior. So what I do know is that work by people like Michael Varnum and Igor Grossman suggests that, yes, over time, at least in the West, there's increasing gender equality. And we have a pretty good idea that sexual norms are changing such that casual sex is more and more typical and less stigmatized. But we still see this behavior, the stereotyping, even in America, where we do have that sort of trajectory toward greater gender equality and that trajectory toward a greater normalization of casual sex. And to me, that would suggest that we probably aren't going to see massive changes in this stereotype, even with greater and greater equality and greater acceptance of casual sex. We might, but if we see it here and now, I would be surprised I would be surprised.
Do you have any data from countries that are even more progressive, like, for example, the European Nordic countries, or not?
We don't know. We talked about that in our sort of future directions, and we've been chatting with folks like Daniel Sneedzer and Oliver Curry, who have some interesting data on something similar. But we would love to do that. And we'd also like to examine the stereotype in countries where sexual behavior is sort of really restricted, because where women have no sexual agency to even have casual sex, for example, in some countries in the Middle East, we might find no stereotype because women just don't have casual sex or don't.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about this paper you wrote, which is titled "Is Nothing Sacred? Religion, Sex, and Reproductive Strategies." where you mentioned the fact that I mean people preferred mating strategies determine their attraction toward or repulsion from religion and not the other way around. And you also say that recent findings suggest that distrust of non-religious individuals is almost completely erased by knowledge that they are following a restricted monogamous lifestyle. So, okay, so what is the relationship here between reproductive or sexual strategies or sexual lifestyle and religion?
Yeah, so I mean, on the surface, the basic link is that a lot of religions um, prescribe sexual behavior. A lot of rules across religions, across cultures, deal with sex, what you can do, to whom you can do it. So there's definitely a link there. The question might be, okay, why? Why are religions so concerned with sex?
And why is it so concerned with sex?
Some of what we'd suggest is that the causal arrow sort of goes in the other direction, and people who want to pursue a sort of more committed sexual strategy characterized by monogamy or serial monogamy, they're best served by making sure that everyone else does that too. And in fact, they're threatened when people pursue less committed strategies. So, for example, if I am a man, I have this wife, I'm pursuing a committed sexual strategy, it's just me and her. But hey, there goes an uncommitted sexual strategist, flaunting his abs at my wife. That could be pretty threatening to me. And worst case scenario, fitness wise, she has an extra pair copulation with him, and I end up raising my wife's child with another man, putting all my resources into that kid. So it serves committed sexual strategists to have other people play the committed game as well, and to prohibit the sort of casual game. So to the extent that religion helps people engage in those prohibitive behaviors and dissuade people from pursuing the more casual sexual behavior, then going to a religion or supporting a religion might be a really nice strategy to pursue your preferred sexual strategy and the fitness consequences, sort of reap the fitness benefits of it.
So, in this sense, religious people would condemn non-monogamous mating strategies because, I mean, if there's lots of people who are looking out for casual sex, for example, or non-monogamous relationships, would that undermine the monogamous people's prospects, or?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. If there are a lot of other people able to pursue casual sex, it makes it harder for me to pursue my committed strategy well, and to
Okay.
benefit from it. Absolutely. Yeah. And I should say that's work that sort of was pioneered by Whedon, Dukes, and Kurzban in some work looking at attitudes toward drug use. So I don't know if people have talked about that on here before, but the short version is people associate recreational drug use with sort of a looser sexual strategy. And it turns out that committed sexual strategy, so if pursuing a committed sexual strategy, is the best predictor of being against recreational drug use, even more so than religion and more so than political conservatism. So we've sort of extended from there, as have people like David Pinsoff and Marty Hazelton, who have shown that the more that people associate gay men's sex with gay men with sexual promiscuity, the more that they are against marriage equality, things like that. So here we're just playing in the atheist realm.
Yeah. And by the way, does this opposition to short-term mating have anything to do with anti-atheist prejudice or not?
Yeah, so that's what our I should say the 2018 paper in Psych Science was led by Jordan Moon, who's a grad student still at ASU, with his advisor Adam Cohen. We were on there together, and so what we found is that people tend to associate, they don't trust atheists. Even atheists don't trust other atheists, and that's pretty well known in the literature. And some of the ideas there are about sort of big gods. So people who are believers or theists are going to be more, you can trust them because they're not going to do anything bad. They know God's watching and will punish them. But what we saw and what we thought is that atheism is associated in people's minds with being a sort of fast sexual strategist or less committed. And one of the ways that I think we've really spoken to that pretty well is that when you give people information about the sexual strategy that atheists pursue, you tell them, okay, this is an atheist, but the atheist wants to settle down and meet the one and all of that stuff, the picket fence and golden retriever. Well, then perceivers view that atheist as trustworthy. When they don't have that information, they view the atheist as untrustworthy. So essentially telling people that atheists are committed override the effects of these, the sort of general perception.
Okay, so does that mean then if religious people get to know atheists that are in committed relationships, monogamous committed relationships, that they trust them more than other atheists?
Yeah, they will. So based on our data, that seems to be the case. And it really shouldn't matter what religious tradition a social perceiver is coming from. As long as they view that atheist as sort of non-threatening, i.e. a committed sexual strategist, then they might view that atheist as being less untrustworthy.
Yeah, but I mean, do atheists also trust religious people more than they trust other atheists?
Yeah, it seems to be the case that even atheists are more just trusting of atheists than religious folks, which goes against what we expect in a lot of our sort of in-group favoritism, right?
Yeah.
And our sort of tribalism, which is fascinating. And we're still playing with that a little bit. I should say so most of the literature talks almost exclusively about how people view atheists as being bad in some way. But people do view atheists positively or positively stereotype them. So as being open-minded, scientific, and like a good wingman at a party, kind of. That's the person that you want to have fun with. So it's not all bad when you're an atheist like me.
Yeah, so just one last question, and going back to the title of your paper, you ask, is nothing sacred? So does that mean that there are other aspects of religion apart from mating strategies that we also can understand? I mean, the specific content of the beliefs that people hold about how society should work, how people should behave, that we can understand better from an evolutionary perspective?
And I think a lot of the content of religions can make a lot of sense. People have done, Joe Henrich has done some really interesting work on the church, and how the church and kinship essentially. But you can look at sort of the prohibitions of religions that grew up in certain places at certain times. So don't eat pork, don't eat bottom feeders, for example, shellfish. Well, okay, you're less likely to get sick if you don't do that. And it makes a lot of sense. In terms of the sexual behavior, I think taking this sort of very removed evolutionary approach can solve some of the mysteries that we have about religion and who is religious. So, for example, some work on religion suggests that, and it does seem to be the case, that a lot of religions have a lot of prohibitions on female sexual behavior. They restrict women's sexual behavior. But at the same time, women tend to be more religious than men, and religiously adherent than men. So if you were looking at that and took it at face value, you'd be like, these crazy women, why are they trying to restrict themselves? Or are they just shooting themselves in the foot or any other area belonging to a woman? So given that a lot of these world religions sort of seek to impose costs on promiscuity, and that women, more than men, tend to favor monogamous mating arrangements. So this is a general cross-cultural sex difference in sociosexuality. Then I think the gender difference in religious adherence or belief seems to be pretty sensical. It serves women to back something that can try and make everybody else pursue the sexual strategy that often serves women. But when we don't look at it that way, we might think, this is confusing.
Yeah, it's interesting since you're talking about women and religion, because it seems that, for example, in Muslim countries, it is women who reinforce a lot those kinds of sexual norms, and I mean they help keeping control of other women's behavior and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's again, we should think about it as kind of a mystery. I mean, why are women doing this to one another? But if you look at it in terms of sort of biological markets or the costs and benefits that have fitness related outcomes, I think we can make a lot more sense of it. And folks like Candace Blake have done this. Some of what I'm doing right now with Sarah Hill and her grad student Katya Cunningham is to look at the idea of why women dislike quote unquote sluts, women who have a lot of sex. And so from a biological market view, you might expect that women, the typical view, I should say first, is that, okay, well, you're breaking a norm, you're gross and dirty, you might take my mate, I don't like you and what you're doing. That's sort of the typical intuitive view. But our view in a sort of biological market view is that women who are more likely to have a lot of sex, short-term casual sex without requiring investment from their male partners, that lowers the value of women's reproductive resources on the biological market. So your sexual behavior, if you are essentially engaging in sexual behavior at lower cost, or you're requiring less investment, your behavior lowers the investment that I can require. Otherwise, it's again one of those sort of big mysteries, we might say, like the Kurzban, Dukes, and Whedon paper. Why should I care if somebody in Alaska who's not related to me is doing recreational drugs? Why should I care if this woman, in Norway is having sex with 40 men a day? Well, maybe I care to the extent that I think her behavior lowers my ability to get what I want and need on a biological market. So like we don't think of Elizabeth Taylor, who got married 8 times, as a quote unquote slut because she got that investment. At least that's what we think. We're currently testing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's because probably if there's more women available to have these sort of short-term mating strategies and be more sexually available to men, then men, that would also influence men in the sense of their being less disposed to or less predisposed to entering long-term committed relationships and investing more of their resources in a relationship.
Exactly. If you sort of think about the basic biological or mating market, men tend to want reproductive access. Females tend to want resources, not always, not solely. There's a ton of variation. But that seems to be the case. And so when men can invest less for more sexual access, that's great for them. And they can do that when the sex ratio is skewed. So when there are more women for every one man. And when the sex ratio is skewed in the other direction, there are very few women, men then have to invest a lot more. And so some work suggests that men are more likely then to go into credit card debt, buy larger engagement rings and those kinds of things in order to attract women. But women can, change the price of their good on the biological market too. And so requiring less investment for short-term sex, if somebody else does that, that can lower the price of investment that I can ask for my reproductive access.
Yeah. Okay, so Jamie, just before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, so I am at kremslab.com, and anything having to do with the Oklahoma Center for Evolutionary Analysis, or OCEAN, there, or Twitter at Jaimie Krems. Otherwise, just please don't Google me. You'll get weird stuff.
Okay, so it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I love your show, and we're all big fans. So thank you for letting us Evo people look like humans and look good and do fun stuff.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been posting interviews for the past 3 years and a half, and I need your support to keep the channel running. And so please pay a visit to my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there for as little as $1 a month. And you also have links to PayPal if you prefer it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Laguerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf, Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Aubrey Hickson, Fergal Cousin, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi. My producers is Izar Webber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.